Very excited to be here. Thank you for having me. Today, the topic of this talk is when buildings design themselves. 2 years ago, I wrote a series of articles for Building Design and Construction magazine based on a number of articles I've been writing for years about the role of automation in design and construction. Over the last few years, every major media outlet has published some kind of an essay with a provocative title having something to do with this. The robots are coming to take your job. One of the most widely cited studies on this topic is from Oxford University. It says that of all jobs, the risk of being automated within the next 15 years is about half. So nearly half of all jobs are subject to being stolen by computers. The job that is least likely to be replaced is telemarketers. So the reason why you're getting more and more robocalls is because they're easy to replace. The job least likely to be replaced, according to Oxford University, is something called a recreational therapist. I don't know what that is, but the study says that your job can be easily explained, it can be automated. The reason why recreational therapists probably won't be automated anytime soon is because nobody knows what it is, so it can't be easily explained. Now, when you turn this to my industry, design and construction, the same study estimated that the chance that construction will be fully automated is about 88%, so a very high percentage of chance of being automated across the construction field. Already, we see a lot of stories like this of robots who are laying bricks and playing other roles on construction job sites. A decade ago, my friend Scott Howe, who works at the NASA JPL, says that there will come a day when no human labor is present on any construction site. There might be drones and other kinds of robots who are doing this kind of labor. What's interesting, though, is the same study, when it turned to architects, I'm an architect, so I have an interest in this question, says that while builders have an 88% chance of being replaced by robots, architects have less than a 2% chance of being replaced. Now, that study was in 2013. Today, there's actually a website called willrobotstakemyjob.com. You can enter any job and see what the chances of being automated are. You can see from the two most heavily searched topics that accountants and lawyers seem particularly anxious about whether they have job security. So naturally, as an architect, I entered architect and found that the same thing. So a decade later, they estimate, even with computers becoming more and more sophisticated, that architects have less than a 2% chance of becoming obsolete as a result of Terminator taking over our jobs. So they rate the automation risk level of architects as totally safe. Now, why is this? So, as I wrote in one of these essays that I mentioned from 2 years ago, can machines design? This is the basic question here. What is it that architects do that machines can't do? If machines can take over jobs on a construction site, why can't they take over our jobs when we're thinking ahead about how things are going to be built? Well, to answer the question whether machines can design, we have to answer the question what design is, which is a surprisingly elusive concept. Gary Hamel, who the Wall Street Journal calls the most important business thinker in America today, says that good design is like the Supreme Court's definition of pornography. We know it when we see it, which is pretty vague. Now, within my own industry, a decade ago, the American Institute of Architects, for 3 days, got together some of the smartest architects in the country to ask this question, what is good design? If you read the report, it says lots of good observations, no consensus. So a lot of great ideas, but nobody could agree what good design is. So that leaves me with a question that's plagued me for years. If we can't say what good design is, how can we practice it? So, and I think the reason is that we think there's something mysterious about what architects do that keeps it safe from robots taking over. Daniel Davis, who's the former head of research for Autodesk, said as long ago as 6 years ago that it is for now emphasis on the for now, impossible to get computers to think creatively. So what distinguishes architects from builders is that we think creatively, I guess. And yet, 6 years ago, people also thought that robots were not capable of doing funky dances, and Boston Dynamics is proving that wrong. Kevin Kelly, who is one of the co-founders of Wired, wrote an incredible book called What Technology Wants. It says that robot replacement is just a matter of time in every field. He specifically calls out architecture as one of those fields that will not be safe. And the reason is this, that there's a burgeoning field of artificial creativity, that in fact, this is considered to be the next revolution in creativity is from AI. In fact, there have been lots and lots of examples, an incredible number of growing examples of machines creating art. Some of it is crap, but then so is some of human art. Ray Kurzweil, who's considered the guru of AI, basically says that by now, computers are capable of approximating, or close to capable of approximating, the computational ability of one human brain. And by mid-century, computers will be capable of mimicking the computational ability of all human brains. The timeline he gives is this, that around now, that as I just showed you, creative AI is capable of making complex art and music. Within a decade, they'll be capable of learning how to create new knowledge without being asked to. And then within a decade or two after that, that AI will be billions of times more capable than biological intelligence. And finally, by mid-century, AI will surpass human beings as the single most smart and capable life forms. So if that's the case from the real experts on this, you return to that series of articles I wrote. We asked our readers, which is primarily architects and builders, about these questions. And one of the questions we asked is whether they feel that automation and AI are threats to job security in their field. Keep in mind that the definitive study says that builders are 88% likely to be replaced by robots. Architects only 2%. But over three-quarters of readers of building design construction 2 years ago said that essentially this would never happen, that it's not a threat to their job security, even though the experts in the field say that it is. So, at heart of this is this question, will AI ever match or exceed the intelligence or creativity of humans? And generally speaking, nearly 80% said no, that's not possible, even though, as I just showed you, Ray Kurzweil and many other experts, Kevin Kelly, say that it absolutely will happen. So what accounts for the disconnect? What's really fascinating here is the 20% gap between how builders answered that question and how architects answered that question. About 2/3, not quite 2/3 of builders say that computers will never match the intelligence and creativity of humans, but over 80% of architects did. So what is it about that? Do architects have less knowledge than builders do about the likelihood of this? Or is it that architects feel particularly insulated in their role? I think at the heart of this is that we tend to think of construction as a trade or a science that can be easily automated, whereas we think of architecture as an art and something that can't be automated easily. Some of the most famous architects who have ever lived have said that architecture is essentially art and nothing else. Fast forward to today, Santiago Calatrava says that architecture is not only an art, it's the most abstract of all arts. Which begs the question, what really is art? Like design, it's one of those sort of elusive terms, far more elusive, in fact. But conventional wisdom is that art is really just about self-expression. You look at all the most popular sources on what art is. That's essentially what it boils down to. And some of the most celebrated architects alive say that the same thing, that architecture is art, and therefore architecture is self-expression, and that is the right of the architect. Possibly the most famous story ever told about an architect, the Fountainhead, is about that it is about the creative genius of the architect. So in a series of columns I wrote for Huffington Post several years ago, I took issue with this and said that I think that if architecture is self-expression, If art is self-expression, we shouldn't think of architecture as that, because architecture is meant first and foremost to serve the public. You can make a painting in your attic and no one ever has to stumble across it, but you can't avoid people using buildings in public space. But this idea is such anathema in our industry, but even just the headline alone angered a number of people. A respected design journalist I know, when I posted this on social media, she responded, "Claptrap." And I asked her whether she had actually read the essay, and she confessed that no, she hadn't. She was just responding to the headline. So the very idea that architecture might not be art is so antithetical to what we have been taught to believe that we dismiss the idea outright. Another friend of mine asked, well, if architecture is an art, what is it? And I said, I don't know that it needs to be compared to other fields or disciplines, but we tend to think of art and science as opposites. So what would happen if we thought of design more as a science and less of an art, meaning we have a methodical process that we use to get to a better outcome, which sounds very promising. But the reality is that this idea of the dichotomy between art and science is very old-fashioned. E.O. Wilson at Harvard says that, in fact, the difference between art and science and thinking of the two as different is a modern conceit, goes back to Descartes, and it is responsible for our challenging relationship with other living systems, meaning climate change and environmental degradation are primarily coming out of the fact that we think art and science is different. And until we close that gap, those relationships will remain challenging. This is the fundamental theme of my book, The Shape of Green, which came out in 2012. It basically presents a set of principles about the aesthetics of sustainable design, or more generally about how the standards of good design and green design should merge. We think of good design as an art, green design as a science, and we should blur the lines between those two things. Over the last decade or two, there's been a growing wealth of research into shape, color, pattern, texture, space, proportions, the designer's toolkit, and we're learning more and more about the virtually universal responses to these things. We know more about the science of aesthetics than we have ever in human history. Some of the most famous buildings really just boil down to simple proportions and geometry, composition. That's math. And if it's math, it can be automated. Even the human face or other natural systems we deem to be beautiful are really a function of mathematical distances and ratios. This is what computers excel at. So why do we think they're not capable of such beauty? So there's been a lot of research in recent years into this, and that we're creating algorithms and other programs that can match beauty or understand beauty well enough, and therefore eventually, if not now, be able to create it in predictable ways. So in the end, what it really begs is, does design really need a designer? Some of the most compelling places that have been created by people can't hold a candle to some of the most compelling places there are. When you visit a place like this, you're just overwhelmed with its beauty in any number of ways. And unless you take a theological point of view, there was no designer involved with this. This is just genetic coding and environmental conditioning, which are things that computers can replicate. So when we look at the growth pattern of flowers, for instance, or other plants, again, it's just genetic coding and environmental conditioning, which is something that arguably eventually we can recreate, not in order to mimic or recreate biological life, but certainly to be able to create designs that are of such profound beauty that they're indistinguishable from other natural systems. Already there have been lots and lots of examples of studying self-assembly and artificial creativity in ways that humans are creating the conditions for these things to arise, but we're not determining directly exactly what form these things take. So when we look into nature and we see all these incredibly profound and resilient places, and the arrogance of us thinking that only we can create great design, but then what we give back to nature tends to look and feel like this. Vast majority of human-made landscapes look like this, to the point where we have to ask whether designers are even capable of addressing the simplest of challenges of our time. The biggest challenge of our time, arguably climate change, is one that we are not tackling particularly well. Conventional wisdom holds that cars and factories are responsible for carbon emissions, but by and large, the lion's share of it comes from buildings. And yet we're not really addressing this very well. The American Institute of Architects, which is the leader of my profession, for the last decade has asked architects to submit their numbers on how they're doing on certain climate action targets. Now keep in mind that about 200 firms out of the maybe 20,000 firms in the US actually submit these numbers. So it's maybe 1% or less of all architects are figuring into these numbers. And arguably they're the leading edge, the people who are actually studying these things and people who care about these things. So, and you can see that they're not really moving the needle very far. When you compare that to what the actual targets have been, we're nowhere near where we need to be. There's a fundamental gap between even the leading edge of architecture and addressing the fundamental challenge of our time. So in conclusion, in that same survey, when we asked whether readers thought that AI is capable of better design and construction, 83% said yes. And yet when we asked whether better buildings created artificially would justify job loss in our industry, they're torn. Just over half said yes. So 83% say, the vast majority of readers, architects, and builders say that AI is capable of creating better places in all the different ways I just showed you, and yet they're really torn about whether they should be doing that if it threatens our jobs. So in the end, I'm left with a basic question: which is more important, architects or architecture? Thank you.